Thank you all for joining us in our second annual conference of the Maternal Gift Economy Breaking Through series, hosted by Genevieve Vaughan and the International Feminists for the Gift Economy. We're so excited to be able to bring back to you the 6 original women who started us off last year: Genevieve Vaughan, Vandana Shiva, Darsha Navares, Heide Goettner-Abendroth, Sherri Mitchell, and Mary Condren. I'm your moderator, Letecia Layson. I see that Sherri Mitchell has not yet joined us, so I'm going to do just a short opening prayer, just so that you have time to actually center yourself, get a little bit grounded in your space, because there's always a little agitation when you come to a Zoom meeting. So just take a breath. And let's just ask the source of all being, you who are all things, in this moment in time as we gather in this virtual space, let us be reminded that love has no boundaries and connects all peoples and all things. Let our minds be present and our hearts open to receive the words that will be given. We'd like to ask the ancestors who are present in whatever land that you are on to support you in this ongoing remembering of the maternal gift economy. Blessed be. Our first speaker today is Genevieve Vaughan. She is an independent researcher who lives part-time in Italy and in Texas. She created the multicultural all-woman activist foundation for a compassionate society that ended in 2005. She founded the Temple of Sekhmet in Nevada, in the Nevada desert, which continues today. And she co-created the International Feminists for a Gift Economy network. Her books are many. Foundational one is Forgiving. So please welcome Genevieve Vaughan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Letecia, and thank you everybody for being here. I would like to really say how much I appreciate being able to do this second conference after a year in which we had many salons, sort of minor conferences, and that we have been working on the gift economy together for quite a while. We are in a total planetary crisis now, as I'm sure you all know. And I think that in order to survive on this planet, we need to find out why, what we've been doing wrong, what's the basic reason, and there is one, I think. I think that there is, that we need to make a leap to a hypothesis for a deep solution. So I want to propose the gift economy as that solution. I've been working on the maternal gift economy for many years, and I believe that it is a deep alternative that permeates all of life, but that we do not recognize it. So to mix metaphors, I'm like a blind person that knows the elephant is there in the living room, but not what it looks like altogether. So realizing other people are blind to it as well, I take many different tacks to bring it into focus and invite everyone to put their hands on the elephant, to understand what it is for them, to name what they perceive, and to realize that it is all part of the same invisible being. This allows us to understand it is there and combine our perceptions. In fact, our series of salons this whole year gives examples of many different ways of practicing gifting, showing different parts of the elephant. Some of these that have come forward in these salons are the indigenous worldview, thinking and language, the gift of the matriarchal model, not a mirror image of patriarchy, the gifts of eco-villages and social experiments, gifts of alternative parenting, midwifery, of truth-telling and activism in politics, of permaculture and earth spirituality, feminist philanthropy, gifts of projects for social support and solidarity, goddess spirituality, gifts of activism for social change, and of support for immigrants, and of gifts, the gift of opposing US policies of war and economic imperialism. I believe that the maternal gift economy is the solution that is hidden in plain sight. Although we all experience it as the model of life when we are infants, we learn to disbelieve and reject it as we grow older, because the economy in which we live is based on quid pro quo exchange. The conflict between the two economies renders gifting impractical and often sacrificial. Doing unilateral gifting in the context of exchange makes the giver vulnerable to exploitation. Because children require unilateral care, mothers do it, but it cannot become generalized because the means of nurturing are not themselves unilaterally given. Nevertheless, children receive the model of the unilateral economy when they are small because they cannot give back an equivalent material product to the mother in exchange. They do respond with smiles, vocalizations, and gestures, but this is based on imitation and turn-taking, not on the obligation to exchange. Because we presently live within the exchange paradigm and interpret most of life in its light, we do not see that gifting permeates everything. For many centuries, patriarchal academia excluded mothers and women in general, and maternal gifting was seen through a male and abstract, non-maternal perspective. Unilateral giving has therefore been seen as morality, exceptional virtue, a biological imperative, but not as a fundamental process of human life and thought. Lacking this perspective, Western philosophers have invented many other answers to questions such as, who are we, how do we know, and what must we do? Viewing early childhood and the unilateral gift economy not as a separate and inferior stage of life, but as the beginning of a continuing thread that is elaborated in many ways, including among its many other variations, its transformation into quid pro quo exchange, allows us to use its logic as an explanatory principle for philosophical questions from which it has been excluded. In fact, satisfying the other's need freely implies the value of the receiver for the giver, who would not have given to her otherwise. This is usually registered by the receiver as contributing to her self-esteem. I call this gift value, and it is prior to exchange value and use value. Including gift value in the concept of economic value gives a very different picture of what value is. We can answer the philosophical questions I mentioned above in a way that is based on the maternal gift economy. Who are we? Not Homo sapiens, the knowing being, because we don't know who we really are. That we really are Homo donans and recipients, the giving and receiving being. How do we know? We receive perceptions from the world around us and give them to each other using the gifts of signs and language. What must we do? We must recognize this, frame our thinking within the gift paradigm, value mothering, giving, and return to the gifting way, which includes recognizing needs at all levels and satisfying them appropriately, and being open to the satisfaction of our needs by others. We need to understand life itself within the gift paradigm. And to do this, we need to reinstate the maternal gift into theories of knowledge and society. There are many alternative readings of Western philosophy that are possible with the gift paradigm in mind. Just to give one example, when the philosopher Immanuel Kant proposed his categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, what he does not realize is that we are already following a universal pattern, though not patriarchal law. The pattern of giving and receiving that is laid down epigenetically as we are being mothered in our earliest years, but which has been made invisible and almost inaccessible by the overlay of the exchange economy and its values. I believe that language itself is structured according to giving and receiving, and I have written a long book about it called The Gift in the Heart of Language, the Maternal Source of Meaning. I don't have time to explain it here, but I just wanted to let you know that that is possible, that interpretation is possible. In order to achieve the change towards the maternal, we need to change our thinking, and we must be able to scale back from the exchange economy, satisfying the need not to cause more and more grievous needs. We have to understand what is not functional to life and create what is life enhancing. Throughout history, his story, mothers and women in general have been the victims of violence perpetrated by patriarchal men, and they have been forced to give unilaterally to the perpetrators. I believe that male violence against women, racial violence against other races, international violence against other nations are largely attempts to force the victims to give unilaterally to the perpetrators. We live in a society dominated by quid pro quo exchange, and the reasons for this multi-level violence are both psychological and economic. We don't recognize this because the gift economy has been invisible, discounted, explained in other ways, and the exchange economy has been accepted as the real and necessary market economy. The gender division of labor and dominant perspective of those who were not the bearers of children eliminated the answers that were to be found in mothering and early childhood. Historically, this was particularly significant after the coinage of money in Asia Minor around 600 BC, which according to Alfred Sonraethel and Richard Seaford, created an abstraction on the reality plane that was, and still is, reflected in an abstraction in thinking. That is, the act of exchange and use of money on the reality plane actually changed the kind of thinking towards abstraction. This kind of change would not have occurred in indigenous societies that did not use money, and among those who, though they live in market-based societies, at least in part of their lives, do not engage in monetary exchange transactions with each other, that is, motherers and children. So mothers and children are practicing an economy that is not an abstract economy. The exchange abstraction also divides humans, defined as exchangers and thinkers, from nature, which is defined as giving and presumably unthinking. If we include gift value, the value attributed to the receiver by the giver that I just mentioned, we can see what it is that the exchange abstraction abstracts from, that is, from giving. Moreover, if we understand giving and receiving as a cognitive framework, we can understand nature as motherer and our gathering perceiving, and transformative work as ways of receiving. That is, these activities are a kind of niche construction, a way we can cooperate with nature so we can more easily receive her gifts and the gift value that we receive from her. In fact, the contradiction caused by the coexistence of the two paradigms of gift and exchange is resolved in many ways that are detrimental to the gift economy and augment and nurture the exchange economy, creating what looks like symbiosis, but is actually a kind of parasitism. Profit itself is a gift that is given upwards in the system by surplus labor, the value of the labor over and above the salary of the workers, by the free domestic work of care channeled into the surplus labor, and by the free gifts of nature seized through commodification. Although the market is said to distribute goods in scarcity, it actually creates the scarcity that makes it necessary by channeling the wealth from the many to the few, and by wasting excess wealth on wars and armaments, expensive elections, and stock market bubbles. Many feminist economists have tried to estimate the value of unwaged, free domestic work in monetary terms, sometimes coming up with startling results. For example, using time use criteria, Ironmonger and Sorpumus in 2012 estimated the USA's 2011 gross household product as $11.6 trillion, as compared to a GDP of 13.3 trillion, so almost equal. If we add to this the Earth's so-called ecosystem services, which have been evaluated by Roberto Costanza and et al. At some $125 trillion a year, compared to the monetized economy's 75 trillion GDP, we can see that the exchange economy actually floats upon a sea of gifts. Bringing the gift economy forward can restore the leadership of those who have life-oriented, gift-giving values, replacing ego-oriented, possessive individualism typical of capitalist market exchange. In fact, we don't realize our maternal gift-giving species is constantly being reprogrammed by quid pro quo exchange to be pernicious to each other and the planet. This programming that excludes and exploits the gift economy is what is creating the planetary disaster, the matricide of Mother Earth, and the suicide of her most maternal species, ourselves, and our brothers and sisters who do gifting in language as well as in life, and the multiple genocide of her infinite variety of species, all of her other children. We can liberate ourselves from the values of the ego-oriented paradigm of exchange and return to the logic of life, the gift economy, the gift paradigm. In doing so, we can at last give the gifts that satisfy the dire collective need for planetary survival. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. That was fabulous. I want all of you, all of our viewers, to understand that each of these women in their thesis struggle to reduce down their commentary to about 20 minutes so that each of the women can bring forward their very dynamic and powerful words. So thank you, Jen. And then Jen is going to be followed by Vandana Shiva. So Vandana Shiva, we are so grateful that you stayed up to be with us tonight. She's calling in from India. Vandana is a trained physicist and did her PhD on hidden valuables and non-locality on quantum theory from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. She shifted her interdisciplinary research in science, technology, and environmental policy, which she carried out in the Indian Institute of Science and the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. In 1982, she founded an independent institute, the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology. So there are many books that Vandana has written. She's most known for her seminal work in seed saving and the wonderful activism that she continues to do around the world to raise consciousness about what is needed to be able to save the planet and the gifts that Mother Earth has to offer. So please welcome Vandana Shiva.
Thank you very much, Letecia. And thank you, Jen, both for your talk today, your amazing life's work. And one big reason I've stayed awake is as a gift.
Thank you. Thank you
For
so
you.
much. Thank you.
And I want to start where Jen left. You know, she gave two figures that if you give a monetary value to nature's economy, according to Robert Constanzo, one of the eminent ecological economics of our time, 125 trillion. And the GDP of the world is 75 trillion. Jen said so powerfully that the dominant economy is floating on a sea of gifts. And it's floating because it's extracting the gifts of Mother Earth, it's extracting the gifts of women, it's extracting the gifts of our ancestors. There's another figure that the indigenous people of the world, who are the people who know how to receive the gifts of Mother Earth with gratitude, how to give back to her, how to share gifts. There is no indigenous culture that only takes. They always have ceremonies of sharing. They always have ceremonies of giving back. I know these ceremonies in my country, and part of what the work we are doing with women peasants is helping them remember these ceremonies just as much as the indigenous people in Turtle Island are fighting gas lines and pipelines through their ceremonies, because the ceremonies is where the culture of the gift is regenerated and remembered, and the power of that ceremony is the nonviolent power through which indigenous people, particularly women, are resisting the violent power of new colonizations, of the fossil fuel empire that has gone absolutely crazy. Yeah, here we are in 2021, where there are typhoons and floods. I mean, Malta is a little island in the Mediterranean, doesn't have floods. Today, the cars are running in the floods. Or British Columbia with this amazing old growth forest being chopped down for toilet paper by spraying Roundup on them. And then the pipelines joining to create floods, wiping out the roads and the highways. This extractivism, of course, creates huge money. The studies for my country show so clearly, you know, East India Company was the first corporation created. Actually, the Dutch East India Company was the first. After that, the British East India Company. But in the 200 years they ruled us, they extracted $45 trillion from India and left famine and hunger. How did they do it? By declaring our land, which we saw as mother and therefore could not own it, as their property. So creating property rights, private property rights, enclosing the commons and appropriating the commons has been a very, very big part of floating on the gift economy. My own work, as Letecia said, has been dedicated since 1987 to saving seeds. And here too, it is so clear what the dominant economy is doing and what our economy is. In India, we never bought and sold seed. We had a culture that, of course, sometimes your seed fades, that you not only have beautiful ceremonies to thank the earth for seeds, beautiful ceremony called Akshaya Tritiya, when the beginning of the cultivation season, where peasants come together, bring their seeds, and the whole day is a gratitude to Mother Earth and a prayer. We will do our bit to serve you and take care of you. Please take care of us. If I run out of seed and I borrow from someone else, I give back 1.5 times that seed whenever it is possible. It's a gift exchange. And then the Monsantos decided they were going to own the seed. How do they own the seed? By taking for free. The amazing gifts that nature has given us, that we have evolved through the application of the mind. The word land races was given to our seeds as if they pop out of the land. No. One wild plant, Oryza sativa, was evolved by our peasants, our ancestors, to be 200,000 varieties of rice. And in North America, one wild plant, teosinte, became the thousands varieties of corn and maize. That co-creation with nature, while thanking her for her gifts, but also doing no harm, because a gift economy has no place for violence. It has a constant consciousness of not doing harm. Mothering means you take care of your baby. You don't do harm. And that is why we've had flourishing. My ecological research over these 5 decades has shown that the more you give to the earth, you give organic matter, there's more soil fertility, there's more food. You don't extract food from the earth in a gift economy. You give back in gratitude a little part of what she gave you. Or water. The earth gives you water, but a little effort in harvesting it, a little effort in using her gifts of streams and groundwater through the water commons creates abundance. We've never had a seed famine. We've never had a water famine. But today we are having these famines because extraction leads to scarcity. And it is now leading to so much scarcity that it is displacing millions. I love the fact that Jen said, our future preparation has to be to receive people uprooted from their homes and lands. In our homes and lands as part of one Earth family. Because Boris Johnson just gave a talk the other day. He says now that there's climate change, we must create new national security states to keep the refugees out. And interestingly, he cites the Roman Empire as having collapsed because refugees came. No, the Roman Empire went and destroyed its supply base by extracting and destroying the soils of the land that fed it. And that's the part of the problem of the capitalist patriarchal egoistic mind, that it causes destruction, but it blames the victims. And that's what's happening right now with the climate. Now, I won't take time talking about COP and talking about Glasgow and everything that happened there. I want to focus on 2 things. One, that colonialism was, through violence, extracting the gifts. Cultures would give the gifts anyway. But this violent extraction and then killing people, genocides, 90% of indigenous people killed, that is what is very much the foundation of the contemporary economy. When people ask me about the economic model, I say, what I recognize is a colonial model. It's been named an economy, but the real economy is the gift economy, because economia is the art of living. The art of living is the art of giving. The art of grabbing, the art of stealing. Aristotle named it chromatistics. It is not the economy. We must stop calling that the economy. We must call the gift economy the economy that sustains life. Nature's gift economy of our breath, of our food, of our water, the gift economies in our commons, the gift economies of the indigenous people. Even now, they are sustaining the earth. Even now, they're sustaining humanity. 80% of the biodiversity on this planet is in the 20% land left with indigenous people. Now, because I started to work on seeds, and I was working on the UN treaties, the climate treaty, the biodiversity treaty, we have managed to put a lot into some of these treaties to ensure polluters would pay, to ensure that, that biodiversity would be seen as what it is. Life in her abundance, her self-organization. Interestingly, the most recent biodiversity COP, like there was a climate COP in Glasgow, the most recent biodiversity COP, COP15, had a whole section where Wall Street and the banks were there talking about biodiversity and nature as a new asset class, a natural asset class. So they took the water, they took the land, they took the seeds, they even took the climate and the atmosphere. Now they want all of nature. So if we think of the 125 trillion that Robert Constanza has talked about, what are these big money makers of today talking about it? First of all, who are the money makers of today? Who are the chromatistics leaders of today? The corporations, of course, but when I wrote my book, Oneness versus 1%, I wanted to understand two things. One, how could Bayer buy Monsanto? You know, Monsanto was the world's biggest chemical seed corporation, and now Bayer was buying it. So I said, you know, whose assets are where? And we did research. And then we found that both are owned by Vanguard and BlackRock. These are asset management companies that were created or grew after the collapse of Wall Street in 2008. BlackRock had less than $1 trillion then. Today, it is 9.5 trillion, just over a decade. And they are the ones pushing the monetization and financialization of nature. So if, you know, I do work in protecting soil and biodiversity and forests. And if the signals are clear to me that indigenous cultures have saved 80% of the biodiversity and 20% of the land, any reasonable system would say, hand over the rest to them. They will take care of it. If women produce more food on tiny pieces of land, the data is very clear. I have about 3 books on this, Women Feed the World. On 50% of the land, in Nigeria, for example, men produce, no, on 5% of the land, women produce 50% of the food. On the remaining 95%, the men produce commodities. And this is the case all over the world, the large-scale industrial farms. So who's feeding the world? Mother Earth is feeding the world. Women are feeding the world. Small farmers are feeding the world. And at this point of catastrophe, with climate change and species extinction, the truly human response should be, let us, A, stand in solidarity with all who are struggling in defense of Mother Earth, and B, ensure that their rights are defended along with the rights of Mother Earth. So I stand with the indigenous people who are being arrested by the RCMP, you know, very, very violently in territories which were never ceded. They are sovereign on their land. And yet, you know, just like the colonials just took land and declared this land is mine, all of India became British property. all of North America became British property. Today, just because they put a gas pipeline through, they say, all this is ours anyway. But if you bring it now to this new extraction, this new commodification of natural asset class, they're doing the opposite. The BlackRocks and these are the, they've created already in New York a new exchange. And Rockefeller is driving it in a big way. And this exchange and the natural assets companies will then sell to the highest investor. They are literally selling rights to ecosystems and their functions. So if the BlackRocks get ownership over a watershed, who will get water from that river will be decided by BlackRock. And because BlackRock is driven by profits alone, they will only sell to other industries, other commercial interests, just like this beautiful lake in the heart of Africa, Lake Chad, used to be a 20,000 square kilometer lake. And then commodity farming came up around it. And 80% of the water that used to recharge that lake started to get diverted to the commodity production. And before you knew it, the lake was dry. And when the lake was dry, the fishing communities, the pastoralists, the farmers who were supported by the water of this lake were now in conflict with each other with that scarcity. So scarcity can be created anywhere by excessive greed and excessive extraction. So the BlackRocks are not talking about 30% for nature to leave it to Mother Earth or those who care for Mother Earth. They're talking about all of the earth belonging to them and 30% becoming their property through selling and buying the ecological functions of nature. Robert Constanza talked about 125 trillion as the honest economy of what nature provides. BlackRock is calculating 4,000 trillion by extracting and monitoring and taking our water and selling it to the biggest bidder, taking the oxygen from our trees, taking the ecological functions of the carbon in the soil. I've written a lot about this in the lead up to Glasgow, but also in my older book called Soil Not Oil. I said, the climate phenomena is really forgetting the earth and her gift economy. She gives so much. And we have had abundance with her living gifts in biodiversity economies. And then a few hundred years ago, they started 200 years ago on coal, 100 years ago on oil, just a few decades ago with gas. They took the dead carbon that the earth had fossilized and tried to totally remake civilization to be run on oil. So we are eating oil, we are wearing oil, we are thinking oil, we are fighting over oil. And then we have climate change. Climate change, everyone knows, is a fossil fuel driven phenomena. And interestingly, gas and oil are rich country resources. So they left them out of Copenhagen, if you notice. There's no mention, even though it should be about fossil fuels, it's only about coal. But even more importantly, there are three greenhouse gases: nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide, which comes from synthetic fertilizers, which is made from fossil fuels, is 300 times more damaging to the climate. That too left out. But what is in there? Net zero. Now, in a gift economy, we create abundance. We don't create zero. We want zero pollution for sure, but net zero is the rich will continue to pollute. And now through this commodification, financialization, and monetization of nature, take your land, your forests, and declare them to be their assets as offsets. These complicated equations are already being worked out. The BlackRocks have already announced they've got the net zero calculus in place. And when you think of the fact that colonization removed the original peoples from the land, the old colonial idea of wildlife protection pushed indigenous people off the land, this new attempt at pretending to protect nature, to create a new asset for the financial economy and the billionaires and the BlackRocks, in effect means a new license to uproot the people who are caring for Mother Earth. So the work on the gift economy, the work on mothering, the work on economies that really generate and regenerate life is more important than ever before. And I would just say that let us together think of how the next year's Women's Day or the next year's Earth Day can be a mobilization globally of reclaiming the gift economy, reclaiming the earth through the gift economy, for the gift economy, and preventing it from being hijacked for the last level of squeezing out the gift till nothing thrives, nothing survives. No insect is alive, no tree is standing, no seed is free. Protecting the future rests on the gift economy. So once again, thank you, Jen, for organizing this, for starting the thinking process on this amazing worldview, and to all of you, love to all of you.
Thank you so much, Vandana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vandana. And if there are any questions that are for Vandana, we will make sure that she gets them, but she needs to get her 2 hours of sleep before she begins her travel. So thank you so much, Vandana, for being with us.
Thank you, Letecia, and thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take good care. Safe travels. Our next speaker is Darsha Navares. Darsha is a professor emerita of psychology at the University of Notre Dame. She's a fellow at the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association. She employs a lifespan interdisciplinary approach to studying evolved morality, child development, and flourishing. She blogs for Psychology Today in a column called Moral Landscapes and hosts a webpage, evolvedness.org. Welcome, Darsha.
Thank you so much, Letecia. So wonderful to be here. Thank you, Jen, for organizing us again for a marvelous day of inspiration. I'm going to show you a few slides on a PowerPoint because there's so many different ideas on it that it's hard to just say them without you getting overwhelmed with information. But seeing it helps, I think, too. So I'm going to talk about how we can restore our humanity from the bottom up. And it's all about the maternal gift economy. We study now in my lab what we call the wellness informed pathway. And it's really the maternal way of raising and maintaining our humanity. And the pathway has 4 pieces that I'll talk about, I'll mention today, and that is to meet our basic needs through the evolved nest, which I'll explain, and that will foster thriving, which we kind of have forgotten what that looks like, I think, which then at the same time develops a heart-mindedness, which then also supports an earth-centered living know-how. So you have to understand what our basic needs are. We are animals and we need nourishment, warmth, protection, safety. Unfortunately, our dominant culture, at least in the States, sort of stops here and, emphasizes those aspects for babies and forgets many of these other needs, which are mammalian needs for affection, pretty constant affection, play, and being included in the community life of the caregivers, our social mammalian needs for extensive bonding and community support, enjoying being with others, and our human needs for having intersubjectivity, kind of a shared mind space with multiple adults. And this occurs when we're immersed in communal life, when we apprentice in adult activities, make meaning through the stories that we're told, the cultural myths, legends, understandings of how to live well, and then opportunities for self-expansion, to be connected to the sense of oneness with the universe, and to have opportunities for healing. All these things are part of our basic needs. And we can identify that when a young person's basic needs, you need all of these as a baby, pretty much. And when you don't get them, your neurobiology just doesn't develop properly. You have gaps in your sense of well-being, you have self-doubt, you have dysregulation in different physical and psychological systems. And so you necessarily get self-centered then, because those needs were not met, which are supposed to be met by the community. And so you have kind of a hole in your heart, or your heart is missing, it's locked down, and you spend your life trying to fill those needs, right? You get obsessed, for example, I think, with breasts because you didn't get enough breastfeeding. And you get obsessed with having more stuff because you feel hungry all the time throughout your life, unless you have healing experiences. So this is the beginning of the pathway to wellness, is meeting the basic needs. And the way we do that is through the evolved nest, what we call the evolved nest, or evolved developmental niche. So this is what we know our species has evolved to provide to young children, especially. So you can see, number one, the soothing perinatal experiences, two, the on-request breastfeeding that goes on for years, and having at least 2.5 years of breastfeeding and caring and responsive care is linked to being a peaceful society. Then there's, so the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 practices here are for the rest of our lives. We need all this. So we all need some positive touch, not negative touch, not corporal punishment. That shifts the trajectory away from a healthy developmental pathway and undermines then the confidence of the child. And in Indigenous communities, you're ruining their spiritual their spirit. And for the rest of their life, they may need to be guided by the outsider because you've undermined their internal moral compass, their compass for growing well, because we have that in us. We don't have to be coerced into becoming a good person. It's there already. We just need a lot of support systems that the evolved nest provides. A positive climate, the individual feels welcome and like they belong, like they have something to offer to the community. Number 5, the self-directed social play. This is not organized sports activities. This is the child running around, or the adults too, playing tag or wrestling, or very creative playfulness. Then allo mothers or allo parents. These are other caregivers beyond the mother. And usually at least 3 people in love with a child is really important for that child to grow well. And again, this is community. The nest is a community provided set of characteristics. It's not all on mother. It's not all on mother and father. It's a community responsibility. And that includes the number 7, the responsive relationships of being, having that mutual impact, the mutual interaction and reciprocity with other people, and having mentors who guide you through life as well, that show up when you need them. And number 8, nature connection, so nature immersion, and then the development of ecological attachment to the place where you live, to the land, the trees, the animals, and feeling responsibly partnered with them. And then number 9, routine healing practices, which are there so that you can rebalance when things get out of whack physically, psychologically, or relationally, or you it also helps you build a sense of community, of bonding with others, and gets you back connected and rooted in the earth. So these are maternal gifts. All of this is what motherers do. And our history then is to, as a species, has been to provide this mothering throughout life. And you can see it in the societies around the world where these are provided, usually in nomadic foraging communities, but other traditional communities around the world as well. Especially important for babies because we're so immature at birth that every experience we have in those first few years affects how well our brain, body, our physiology, our psychology grows. Then we have to understand where we're aiming for. What does this all provide? What does the nest get us? It gets us thriving individuals and thriving individuals in relationship. And you can see the characteristics are many. That's why I'm showing this slide, because it's so many things to remember that we kind of have forgotten. And at least in the United States, it's really hard to find people, or very many people, that have these characteristics. Because we stress people so much, we undermine their early development, not providing basic needs, always making them feel insecure for various reasons. To make a good consumer, you have to make them want something they don't have, for example. All right, so thriving individual then has a quiet mind and inner happiness and vitality. They're fully alive. They have autonomy. They know they follow their inner compass and follow that spiritual guidance, the thing that Western science has a hard time talking about. It's that inner psychic compass. And they're honest, very honest, with a non-put down sense of humor. They have outstanding memory and senses, build habits at will, have know-how for getting along on the particular landscape, with ecological attachment and a connection to spirit, something beyond the self. That makes you feel at one with the universe. And then in relationship, they enjoy being with others and enhance other people's well-being. And they're relationally attuned and responsive. They give empathy. They listen unconditionally. They're communally oriented, authentically helpful, providing love and forgiveness. They're generous, egalitarian, and they respect their ancestors and future generations with a deep responsibility towards the web of life. So these are things that we see in the societies that provide the evolved nest, that are wellness oriented, where everyone is a motherer to one another. Now, what happens in the non-nested societies is a lot of these things are missing. There's instead of having this flow, thriving in relationship is just a very enjoyable flow of being with others. It's not hard. It's so embedded in your experience and your capacities that it all goes well. And you can see in these societies that people get along most of the time extremely well. Whereas if we now, without our basic needs met, try to work on these thriving in relationship aspects, it's going to feel hard to us potentially, because we didn't have those early building blocks, the layers and layers of skills and sub-skills that come from being embedded in a society that provides for your basic needs through the evolved nest. What happens ideally then, in a society that provides for basic needs and leads to thriving, is you spend most of your time in positive social engagement. As I said, it's just a great deal of shared music and dance and song and laughter, and you're emotionally engaged, and your imagination, your ability to abstract is focused on connection, on enhancing others, on honoring the sacred web of life, maintaining harmony and balance. And there's just a high communalism along with a high autonomy of your own choices. So everyone's an individual at the same time of feeling communal. And very little time is spent in what I call social self-protection, where you hide away from others or you try to dominate them. Unfortunately, in our dominating cultures, that's what's enhanced. Because your basic needs aren't met, you don't feel nested, you feel unsafe, you spend more of your time in social self-protection than you do in social enjoyment and engagement. But back to the wellness informed pathway, your heart-mindedness is developed then. It becomes part of you as a thriving individual. You're relationally attuned. You're fully emotionally present in the moment. You share intersubjectivity or mind communications. You resonate with the other. You have an egalitarian regard for the other, an I-thou relationship instead of an I-it, treating others like objects. And you have a small ego because you're oriented to being a group member, a collaborator, a partner, a relationally attuned member of the community. And so these things are primed by secure attachment in early life, by the companionship care of the evolved nest. And you're on the right side there, communal imagination. That's how you use your abstract thinking. You're thinking of things outside the present moment. You think communally. You don't think viciously to control and extract from others and take and manipulate. Because you feel connected to everything and you feel responsible, you have a sense of sympathy, of agency and communion. Your ability to do things is rooted in your empathy and your sense of connection with the community and with the other than human. So not just people, but the natural world's entities as well. Rivers, mountains, animals, plants are part of your capacity to plan and to create systems or ways of being that enhance those as well, the other than human. So this flow of being these things are constructed or co-constructed from experience after birth. And these are then require the motherer, require the maternal gift economy, because it's through experiencing the maternal gifting that you become a gifter as well. So what the baby practices is what they become. And then finally, the fourth aspect is it leads us the wellness informed pathway of meeting basic needs to the evolved nest, building thriving, building heart-centeredness, leads us then to this one, the fourth, the know-how for sustainable earth-centered living. And it leads you to this statement, this kind of belief that Aldo Leopold put together, which is an indigenous perspective. It is, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And you avoid doing what's wrong in this wellness-informed result. We can see this contrast then with the two worldviews identified by Robert Redfield, a social anthropologist. He said there's essentially two views. One has the perspective that the cosmos is unified, sacred, and moral. So that's the right side of this page in green. And that's our indigenous, our baseline. You can see it all over the world in traditional societies, that spirit pervades everything, that we're mutually related with everything. So that means not just people, but with animals, plants, mountains, and rivers, etc. Humans are the younger siblings, so we have much to learn from others, the mosses, the trees, the animals. And we have then in this perspective a sense of being placeful, at home on the earth. This is our place and we need to respect and care for it. And we fit in with the local landscape in the bio community. We don't try to manipulate it according to some abstract ideal. And we are in the gift economy, the reciprocal sharing that goes on and on. The maternal gift economy is built on nature's gift economy, where there's just a constant flow of gifts. And then on the left side, this is where we have gotten stuck, or our dominant culture is stuck in the last few centuries in particular, where it's the view is that the cosmos is fragmented, disenchanted, amoral. It doesn't matter much what you do with it, except that humans are the best, are the pinnacle of creation or evolution, and only humans really count. They are the only ones with spirit. And you have a sense of restlessness, that you don't feel home on the earth because it's all dead and inert anyway, right? And we're manipulating it like objects. And you want to conform everything to your abstract ideal. You want to have green lawn, kill out all the native plants. You can have a monocultural lawn, for example. That's just a recent desire. And you hoard things because, again, you have that hole in your heart. You have missing, your heart is missing. You've got the gut survival feeling of needing more because I don't feel safe. Or you have the intellectual mind that we train up in schools that is very divorced from relationship, from responsibility, from emotions, from intuition. And then it sounds good. Yes, I'm a rational decision maker and I can take whatever I want and it'll make everything better if I'm selfish, all this crazy ideas. That's part of our dominant culture right now. So we need to move back to the right side, to our Indigenous perspective. We need to follow the wellness-informed pathway where we meet the basic needs through evolved nest provision that promotes thriving. We develop a heart-minded individual and communities, and that accompanied by know-how for deeply sustainable life. Now, we all know we're not there, are we? This is the pathway. This is another way to look at how we can intervene. We want to first provide, number one, companionship care from conception. So that's the evolved nest. And that's going to create, number two, the healthy psychosocial neurobiology, where we actually can become our fuller human, reach our full human potential. That leads to adults who actually develop and maintain well-being, become wise elders, and they create the community that attends to those basic needs and keeps the cycle going. We can intervene at any of these points. So we can make sure we provide the evolved nest to the young, intervene when that hasn't happened with healing practices, help adults realize the importance of this, educate them, and make sure we're telling the story of who we really are. We are evolved social mammals with certain practices that came about. We evolved away from being chimpanzee-like. We evolved big social brains that require the maternal gift economy to fuel, to provide the calories, to provide the nurturing, to maintain a big social brain that is oriented to egalitarianism and that's oriented to the gift, the gifting of the sharing that we see all over the world. So we really have to return then. How do we get there? Healing ceremonies, I think, is one thing we can do, all of us, every day. Communitas is that feeling of being one with others, and it kind of comes upon you sometimes in disasters, sometimes even in the workflow or in the family gathering, to feel like there's no status differences, to feel like everyone's alive together, that kind of siblinghood. And we need to promote then these communitas experiences to promote community bonding, healthy relationships, individual healing, and of course, respect for nature. And I will stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Darsha. I think there's a lot there to think about and to review. Diane mentioned in the comments that this PowerPoint will be available with the recorded video so that you can take a look at the slides again. And our next speaker is going to be Heide Goettner-Abendroth. So where Darcia brought us through the evolutionary expression of what it means to be a good human being, Heide is going to speak to us directly about the piece that Genevieve says seems to always be missing, which is about the mother and modern matriarchal studies. Heide Goettner-Abendroth is a mother and a grandmother. She earned her PhD in philosophy of science at the University of Munich, where she lectured for 10 years. She has published in the philosophy of science and extensively on modern matriarchal societies and culture through her research, and is the founder of Modern Matriarchal Studies. Her opus is Modern Matriarchal Studies, on Indigenous cultures across the globe, which was published in 2013. It is a fabulous book where she defines scientifically this new field of knowledge and provides a world tour of examples of contemporary matriarchal cultures. So let us welcome Heide and how she will identify the gifts of modern matriarchal study and where we are with that. Welcome, Heide.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Letecia, for your kind welcome, and Genevieve for inviting me. Genevieve invited me very often to speak, and I often spoke about I very often presented the way I define matriarch societies anew and show that this definition is adequate to their life ways. And I often spoke about matriarchal politics. It is the outcome of this knowledge. This time I want to give a more theoretical talk. I want to talk about modern matriarchal studies. This new field of knowledge is about to change our understanding of society and history completely. And so I would like to present to you what it is. What is it? What is this strange thing, modern matriarchal studies? This is my explanation I would like to give you this time. The foundation of a new social science, modern matriarchal studies. Two questions at the beginning. The misinterpretation of the concept matriarchy as rule of mothers or women has led hundreds of scholars operating within the patriarchal framework to adhere to this fiction in their quotations. Some even consider it good style to constantly parade this misconception like a mantra. Other scholars have combed through the historical and anthropological records with smug irony, searching for such societies and, of course, not finding any. This shows that the definition of matriarchy as rule of mothers is an empty one, which can neither be used nor quoted. How is it possible to do scholarly work without ever having defined the area under discussion? The other fundamental question here is, how can anyone know anything with certainty about matriarchy? And how can one define it at all if the subject is pushed to the margins and buried in prejudices? What are the methods to redefine it based on empirical findings, not on ideology? Now, some words on traditional matriarchal studies. Traditional matriarchal scholarship has existed for a long time in the German language realm, already beginning in 1861 with Johann Jakob Bachofen's work on motherhood. 10 years before that, the anthropological field of matriarchal studies was initiated by Henry Louis Morgan. For more than a century, the discussion about motherhood and matriarchy continued in both bourgeois conservative and Marxist leftist circles, especially by Friedrich Engels, but exclusively from a male perspective. In the process, the topic was used and misused from the most various viewpoints by philosophical schools and political movements. Astonishing in these various works on the topic motherhood or matriarchy is, despite good collection of material, the lack of a clear definition and a philosophical scholarly foundation of this research area. The concept matriarchy remained so indistinct that nearly everyone could understand it in a different way. That omission has opened the gates for emotions and ideologies that have burdened this research from the very beginning. All too common are cliches about the essence of woman, which only reveal that in this area, self-reflection within the critique of patriarchy has never occurred. As a result, there are massive back projections of patriarchal conditions onto early cultural history, similar to the projections in anthropology onto non-Western indigenous societies, a situation that makes many so-called research findings worthless. This is why all of traditional matriarchal studies rests on a shifting foundation. Now, modern matriarchal studies. Modern matriarchal studies is a scientifically well-grounded field of research. It has appeared over the past few decades and is rapidly undergoing further development. Through my own work in German language since 1978, a definitional, methodological, and theoretical basis was created, without which this research could not achieve its wide-ranging goals. This task consists in creating an adequate representation of the matriarchal societal form in all its enormous geographical and historical breadth. Providing it with a scientific foundation entails first, formulating an empirically grounded, adequate definition of matriarchy, capable of grasping the deep structure of the societal form. Second, developing an explicit methodology able to discover and analyze all phenomena within this field of research. Third, developing a theoretical framework that can integrate a huge mass of material consistently, material that only exists in scattered and misunderstood form, thereby grasping the great breadth of matriarchal societal form systematically and with sensitivity. Now to these three requirements. The definition of matriarchal society. The first requirement of a scientific foundation was fulfilled when I developed a structural definition for the field of research matriarchy. I made comparative studies of as many currently existing societies of this kind as possible in order to find their common denominators on the four societal levels: social, economical, political, and cultural. That is, the new definition of matriarchy was not produced in abstraction and thus projected onto the field of study. Instead, it was developed inductively, step by step, through analytical observation of these societies. An adequate definition of matriarchy must be given for all levels of society: the social level, the economic level, the political level, and the level of worldview and culture. This means a complex definition which reveals the underlying deep structure of matriarchal society. Therefore, I call it a structural definition. As I have presented this definition very often, I summarize it here in the most extreme brevity. This definition asserts that matriarchy on the social level is a non-hierarchical society of kinship whose main features are a clan organization based on matrilineality, kinship in the mother's line, and matrilocality, residence with or near the mother. At the same time, the genders are valued equally, gender equality. On the economic level, matriarchy is a society of balanced economic mutuality in which women manage the basic goods such as land, houses, and food. They have no right of ownership, but of distribution, and they pay constant attention to balancing the economy through equal distribution. Such an economy has the qualities of a gift economy. On the political level, matriarchy represents a society of consensus, with a political basis in the clan houses, where decision-making takes place, and with a system of male delegates to the diverse councils outside. This gives the men no power to decide over others, but gives them their own sphere of activity and social status. In most cases, this system results not only in a gender egalitarian society, but also in a fully egalitarian society. On the cultural level, matriarchy is based on a sacred culture, in which there are no aloof male gods, but where the world view is defined by the feminine divide. In this definition, the necessary conditions required in order to speak of a matriarch society are matrilineality and, in the economic realm, women's power over distribution of the goods. At the same time, gender equality prevails, expressed in the principle of consensus in decision-making, from which no one is excluded. When these features appear in an existing society, one can speak of a matriarchy. Now to the second requirement, an explicit methodology. The second requirement was fulfilled by explicitly specifying a valid methodology for modern matriarchal studies. In traditional matriarchal research, the methodology was not described anywhere. Very early on, I showed that for modern matriarchal studies, such a methodology must rest on two pillars: a broad interdisciplinarity and a thorough critique of ideology. Regarding interdisciplinarity, it is obviously necessary in order to understand an entire societal form along with its history. With it, we eliminate the fragmentation of knowledge which arises through breaking it up into the traditional disciplines and thereby obscuring larger connections. Unlike in these disciplines, it is no longer a matter of specialization, but of the recognition and integration of social and historical connections. The critique of ideology, what always means patriarchal ideology here, also requires a method, so as not to lose itself once more in obscured ideology. From the very beginning, I sketched out such a method and elaborated it later. I utilize both a negative and a positive process. The negative process identifies the typical prejudices about matriarchy found everywhere in the scholarly literature up to the point of self-contradiction. Interdisciplinarity is very advantageous here because comparison of expert opinions from various disciplines or even within a single discipline reveals incomplete, one-sided and distorted representations. The positive process evaluates the factual findings of traditional matriarchal studies after they have been freed of these prejudices. Even though these findings remain unconnected in traditional research, they can be integrated into the theoretical framework of modern matriarchal studies, where they find their logically correct place. Now to the third requirement, a theoretical framework. The third requirement is the development of precisely this theoretical framework for modern matriarchal studies. It shows the scope of modern matriarchal studies. It began as a research program and was carried out in steps. In the first step of developing modern matriarchal studies, I provided an overview of previous studies of matriarchy up to the present. Here, I followed the course the research has taken, using examples of the scientific as well as of the political discussion. And I shed light on the diverse disciplines in which studies on this topic, often not named and masked, can have been done. In the second step of developing modern matriarchal studies, I formulated the adequate definition of matriarchy, which was urgently needed. It was derived by exploration of a vast amount of anthropological material. Here we see the systematic place of anthropology, since it is not possible to arrive at the full definition of matriarchy from cultural history alone. There we have only remnants and fragments of past societies, yielding only scattered bits of information and no longer providing a complete picture. Those who do not wish to lose themselves in speculation about cultural history should dedicate themselves to the still existing matriarch societies in order to understand the societal form. Therefore, in the course of my work, I found out and presented the matriarchal societies of today all over the world, which still exist in Asia, Africa, and America. In the third step, the complete structural definition of matriarchy is used as a scientific tool for a revision of the cultural history of humankind. This history is much longer than the 4,000 or 5,000 years of patriarchal history. In its longest periods, non-patriarchal societies were developed in which women created culture and embodied the center of society. Extant matriarchal societies are the last examples. For the very first time, we have the opportunity to adequately write the complete history of humankind worldwide, for we can do so without the distortions of patriarchal prejudices. This new interpretation of history is urgently necessary today, because the patriarchal interpretation of history more and more turns out to be wrong and outdated. I started this project with rewriting the matriarchal history of the vast cultural areas of West Asia and Europe, and rewriting the matriarchal history of the other continents will follow. The fourth step of developing modern matriarchal studies deals with the problem of patriarchy's origin. Two important questions must be answered here. First, how and where were patriarchal patterns first able to establish themselves? Here it must be explained how patriarchal patterns arose in different cultural places, on different continents, under different conditions, and at different times, independently from each other. For there does not exist only one single reason for everywhere in the world, so the answers will be very different for the different regions of the world. Second, how were patriarchal societies able thereafter to spread throughout the world? The rise of patriarchy after the appearance of some first patriarchal patterns scattered somewhere is not at all self-evident, and it was a long process, lasting throughout the patriarchal millennia up to the present time. This task has been simultaneously taken up by my new project of rewriting the matriarchal history of the different continents. In the fifth step of the development of the framework of modern matriarchal studies, a deep analysis of the millennia of patriarchal history is necessary. Until now, the history of patriarchy has been written down as a history of domination, a history from the top. But there also exists the perspective of history from the bottom, which shows a completely different picture. It is the history of women, of the lower classes, of the marginalized cultures, and of the subcultures. It shows that patriarchy did not succeed in destroying the ancient and long matriarchal traditions on all continents. In the end, it parasitically lives on these traditions. The task is to show that these traditions, such as oral traditions, customs, myths, rites, folklore, and others, have their roots in the preceding traditions of matriarchy. If we can manage to follow the traces backward through the history of patriarchy and to connect them, this means nothing less than regaining our heritage. So far to the theoretical framework of modern matriarchal studies, which shows you what it all includes. Modern matriarchal studies includes all of this, and so it entails a complete change of perspective on society and history, or in other words, it is a new paradigm. As a new paradigm, it does not represent, in spite of its systematic, a closed system. And it does not make, in spite of its far-reaching explanations, any universal statements about content. A paradigm needs to leave gaps in its early stages, because it is not the role of a paradigm to act as a lexicon. Its achievement is to create a farther-reaching explanatory framework from a viewpoint that differs from what was previously known. Then it can be taken up by different researchers for their own studies and developed further, so that generations of scholars can continue to work creatively with a new paradigm of modern matriarchal studies. And this, I hope, will become more and more a gift to all of you and to all of those who want to know more about a non-patriarchal matriarchal society and a matriarchal history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heidi. That was a very thorough explanation of modern matriarchal studies. And did I hear you say that you were rewriting? Are you rewriting your book? Oh my goodness.
Oh, I'm rewriting cultural history, and I started with the regions of Asia and Europe, and I will continue. You see, cultural history is so much distorted by patriarchal ideology and prejudices. We have to rewrite it. And it's not only from me, there are so many scholars who contributed to this, which I put together and I hope, make a whole picture of how history of cultures develop completely different than the mainstream will tell us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Heidi, for that. And as a beautiful bridge to that, oftentimes what patriarchy does is erase the living traditions that have had a contiguous expression of their gifts from their matriarchal cultures into even today. And it is very, very important for us to recognize that they still coexist, even though patriarchy every day, as Vandana Shiva mentioned, that the colonial extractive mentality, which we consider patriarchy, continues to try to suppress and repress. Those cultures are alive today and they thrive today. So with great pleasure, we welcome back Sherri Mitchell. She was born and raised in the Penobscot Indian Reservation. She received her Juris Doctorate and a certificate in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy from the University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. Sherri is an activist who's very involved in Indigenous activism, specifically with the environment, but she is also an author whose well-known book, Sacred Instructions, and is now writing, I think this year, 3 books that we hope will be birthed soon. It has been a challenging year for us all, but we are awaiting her work as well. So without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to Sherri so that she can do her Indigenous introduction herself. Sherri, welcome. We're so glad to have you back.
Kchiwiliwan Letecia, Kwe Pasidawin, and Dilnabamakawasus, Nagakakagus. And Deliwisi Wanahamu Gwasat and Najio Banawabskewi, Nalita Haziu and Diane. My name is, in my language, is Wanahamu Gwasat. And Heide does a great job of always calling me by that when we happen to be walking down the same street with one another. And I just want to mention, I've seen some of you in the past year, and I haven't seen Heide in a long time, so it's so wonderful to see your face. And I just want to give you a squeeze. I want to start off by reading some things from the book and then go into discussion about some of the things that I think are continuing to challenge us and women. I'm getting ready to leave on Monday to go to Palm Springs for TED Women, where I will be giving a doing a workshop on decolonizing women to women relationships. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about there, I'm going to bring up here today, which are things that are sometimes challenging for us to face as women. So I want to read a little bit from the beginning of the book, just to get a framework of, from my perspective as Skajinui-Yapid, an Indigenous woman, Najeo Wabanakieg, what our perspective is here in this territory. Where I grew up, there are hundreds of Indigenous populations around the world, and they all have their own unique cultural practices and traditions and ideologies and languages, ways of being, ways of knowing that are not homogenous. So this concept of a pan-Indigenous philosophy is really a fallacy. That's part of the colonial patriarchal structure of equating oneness with sameness and trying to homogenize everything, which actually causes erasure. And it's really important for us to pay attention to this. So I'm only speaking from my own tradition as Vanawebskewi from this territory. So this is from chapter 11 in Sacred Instructions, Women are the water bearers of the universe. As Skajinui-Yapid, an Indigenous woman, I have been taught that the women nurture life into being. We are the creators of life and the protectors of the life that we create. Women possess a unique magic. As women, we are able to call forth life from the other side and cultivate that life in a quiet space below our hearts. Within our bodies, we hold an opening to the divine, a portal that allows souls to enter into this world. Because we are connected to the divine through the space governed by our hearts, we are also the keepers of divine intuition and heart-based wisdom. Thus, the teachings that we carry are essential for keeping our societies spiritually healthy and emotionally balanced. We are indispensable to the perpetuation, protection, and balancing of life. When the women are absent, when they are silenced or ignored, the heart-based wisdom needed to guide and balance life is missing. And life goes into disharmony, causing the safety of all to come into question. The entire cycle of life unfolds inside a woman's body each month as the lifeblood of the earth and the building blocks of creation flow through her. During this sacred ceremony, a woman is open to the divine and deeply connected to the energies of the earth. This is when she is most powerful. It is said that the women don't need the same ceremonies as the men because their bodies naturally enter into a ceremony each month. If they are conscious of the energies flowing through them, they can use these energies to heal and cleanse their bodies and spirits. The Moon Lodge was not built to separate the women from the rest of the community, as many have claimed. It was built to allow the women to focus the power flowing through them during the sacred time of opening between worlds so that they could focus that power into the creation of life or direct it toward healing. The women are not only the creators of life, they are also the keepers of the thread of life that connects us through time. As the life force flows through them each month, it connects them to the very source of life that created us all. Without the guidance of the women, this thread becomes lost, and the hearts and spirits of the men and the children become disconnected. This devaluing of women within our society has led to a rise in violence against the bodies of women. This has been reflected in outward attacks on the body of the mother as the flesh of the earth was simultaneously torn, burned, and raped. And now we're starting to see another rise in patriarchal violence against women's choice and women's bodies. As women rise in positions of leadership, we're again seeing the correlation and rise in attacks against women's bodily autonomy, but also an amping up of the attacks on the body of Mother Earth. And so all of this madness that's associated with that destruction and that violence is caused by the absence of divine feminine wisdom within our societies. Even the women who rise to the top of the current system do so without the presence or assertion of this vital matriarchal wisdom. It is only the women who have learned to talk like the men who are taken seriously within the current power structures that govern our societies. The women who are standing up and speaking on behalf of life are still being silenced. I'm talking about the women who are standing in protection of our sacred waters, who are on the front lines of some of these pipeline fights that Vandana Shiva talked about. They're still being silenced, ridiculed, and shunned. The women who are not talking in the voice that echoes the academy are not invited to the table. Those who are challenging the entitlement and status quo of patriarchal colonization are not being invited back to the table. And so this type of violence women to women that often takes place within some of these circles is also helping to create an escalation in the threats to all life that is now placing all life in danger. And so when we start thinking about what we're facing, this process of breaking through, we can't think about breaking through without thinking about the skewed sense of value that has been perpetuated through the patriarchy and patriarchal colonization. And to look at the fact that there is no value being given to the sacredness of life. And that one of the hallmarks of colonization is this idea of homogeneity. It's the idea of oneness and sameness being equal, which is one of the biggest fallacies that we're facing. The ability of one to own their own autonomy. When I tell somebody that I'm sovereign, when I talk about my own sovereignty, what I say is, for sovereignty, it means I own myself. I'm responsible for my own behavior and my own relationships. There's all of this that's contained within this phrase. And so when we're talking about sovereignty, when we're talking about being in relationship with the earth, this concept of being stewards over the earth is really a patriarchal, dominance-based imposition. That's not how we view ourselves. We view ourselves as stewards of our own relationships with with Mother Earth, and that we have this way of life, that carries us and helps us to understand what are all of the aspects of that relationship that we carry, that we're responsible for stewarding with the rest of the living beings on Earth. And so when we start thinking about how that is impacting us in the ways that we're presenting these notions of matriarchy, we have to be very, very careful that we're not carrying into this process patriarchal ideas of dominance and entitlement, patriarchal ideas of homogenization. When I hear the words, the word indigenous, saying that this is everyone's original state, that's probably true. We all come from somewhere, right? But the word indigenous has very powerful and very specific legal and political connotations that are impacting peoples who are living in their indigenous ways of life today. And when we homogenize the word indigenous, and when we don't take into consideration the legal and political ramifications of that term in its modern context, what we're doing is we are erasing all of the issues that are being faced by those people. It's like saying, I don't see color. And so when you don't see the implications of that homogenization, and you don't understand its attachment to violence, diminishment, disappearance, erasure of Indigenous peoples, when Indigenous women are 10 times, not 10%, 10 times more likely to experience violent physical attack than any other woman on the planet. The use of that language, the diminishment of the legal and political association to that terminology, helps to foster an invisibility of the issues being faced by those individual groups who exist as distinct bodies, not as part of a homogenized whole that encompasses the entire planet. I think that's really important for us to say, because that's very dangerous. And then also, when we think about colonization is about taking, right? We've seen colonization in the form of taking of land and of the waters, the stripping away of language. There were laws on the books until 1978 in the United States that prohibited Indigenous peoples within this country from speaking our own language. My grandmother was severely abused in an Indian residential school for speaking her own language, and she didn't know how to speak English. And every time she opened her mouth to communicate, she was beaten. And so, we have to recognize that the implications of colonization are not something that are historical. They're not something that's in the past. It's something that's happening right now. And so what we're seeing now is eighth wave colonization. So being stripped of our land, being stripped of our sacred places, having our ways of life attempted to be destroyed through colonization to date has not been enough. Now that Indigenous people are finally able to practice their own ways of life, right? And to engage with their own ceremonial ways of being, to speak their own languages, there's a taking of that. And so the taking of Indigenous identity, the taking of Indigenous knowledge has now become the new wave of colonization. And so there are so many people that are trying to market themselves and are trying to promote Indigenous knowledge without having not had any experience with living that way of being themselves. And I think that we need to really be conscious of this. I really admire Vandana Shiva, because she said, I support the women who are standing on the front lines of these pipelines. And I uplift their ways of knowing and their ways of being. And she never once tried to speak on our behalf. She never once tried to claim the knowledge of Indigenous people as her own. And I think that's really important, because this is something that has happened historically, where women have centered and amplified their own voices at the expense of other women. And if you're recognizing that a population of people has knowledge that's important to what we are doing right now, then you bring those people in and you allow them to speak on their own behalf in their own ways, with their own sense of knowing. Because this anthropological review of Indigenous knowledge is another form of erasure of Indigenous women who carry that knowledge and who are the keepers of that knowledge. And so there needs to be a greater inclusion of that voice being centered in these circles. And there needs to be a recognition that that those women's voices need to be the ones being heard, and that the appropriation of Indigenous knowledge and the homogenation of Indigenous knowledge is another form of violence against Indigenous peoples, and specifically against Indigenous women, who are the keepers of the knowledge that's being portrayed in that way. And so I just felt it was really important to say that today, because it's the new trend. I just, in the past year, have trained literally over 2,000 scientists and scientific scholars who are working and interfacing with Indigenous knowledge around the world on how to do that from an ethical perspective, how to do that in a way that actually grows relationships rather than severs relationships, how not to claim an entitlement to somebody else's ways of knowing and ways of being as a way of stealing their identity. It's really a very clever new form of identity theft that I think is important for us to talk about. And so I also want to go back to something that Vandana Shiva talked about, which is the women who are standing up on the front lines of these pipeline projects, because it's always the women. It's always the women. There are grandmother camps on all of these locations. And she talked about the small percentage of Indigenous lands that remain in the hands of Indigenous peoples, as being only 20% of Indigenous lands that are retained by Indigenous peoples. But 80% of the untouched lands on the planet are in the hands of Indigenous peoples. And so we may have lost 80% of our land, but 80% of the land that remains on the planet that is still sustainable and thriving within their individual ecosystems is in the hands of Indigenous peoples. Because we steward our relationship with that land in such a way that we honor all life and all of the living beings who share that system with us. But it's always the women who are standing there in protection of the sacredness of life, because those are the teachings that we have been raised with. And so when I think about my relatives at Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe originally were in this territory, and their stories talk of their migration to the west, to the place where the rice grew on top of the water, these wild ricing lakes. And so we've had ceremony here bringing our two groups back together. We're all Algonquin-based people, and we have essentially not only the same language base, but we have the Anishinaabe and Wabanaki. Much of our language is identical. And so when the attacks are happening on these pipeline standoffs, this is not accidental. There is a purposeful attack against Indigenous rights being waged in those locations. And as Vandana Shiva said, Indigenous rights are the last stronghold that exists for the protection of the earth. And that's why corporations are so intent on destroying Indigenous rights, and that they specifically choose to go through Indigenous territories, because every time they're successfully able to win legal battles to move through Indigenous territories, they diminish Indigenous rights. And that diminishment of Indigenous rights is paving the way for them to dispossess Indigenous peoples of the rest of their lands, which means end of life on the planet, because we've seen what happens with all the other lands that have been taken from Indigenous peoples, in that the destruction of them is complete. And so if we want to avoid that, it's important to stand with Indigenous people, not only in theory, but in body, to stand with them in the protection of these places. And we've seen these types of attacks systematically happening over the last 15 years in the United States and Canada, where there's this purposeful attack. And that's, again, it's an attack on the body of the woman. It's an attack on the body of Mother Earth. And it's a devaluation of the sacredness of life. And that's part of the problem with the exchange economy, is that there's no place for valuation of life. And it's the same kind of thing with Vandana Shiva talked a little bit about, these people that want to attach the economy to the earth. The earth dollar is a movement that is specifically targeting Indigenous peoples. They are specifically targeting Indigenous populations, and they're attempting to align with Indigenous peoples, because they know that they need Indigenous lands and the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples as a legal and political body to be able to do what they want to do with the earth dollar. But it's just another tactic to try to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands. So we have all of these things that are going on that look like, oh, this is a different thing, but it's really just the perpetuation of colonization and the same type of patriarchal capitalist ideology of taking. And so when we start to recognize the underlying pattern of that taking, and we want to be able to create an economy that's based on the wisdom of the matriarchs, that's that maternal gifting economy that's based on the way a loving mother or grandmother cares for her children. When I want to understand what that looks like, I look to my own traditions, my own teachings, because we're matriarchal, we're matrilineal, we're matricultural here in Wabanaki. And so when I think about that, I look to my own language. What does that look like? What does that mean? Pasilda and Dilnabamak, we understand our connectivity, our interdependence, our interconnectivity to all life as a foundational basis for who we are. And then we think about this term that I've talked about quite frequently, alabizu, which is recognizing that my sense of having enough to live my life in a dignified way and with safety and with all of the things that I need, that caring, that protection, that love, that sense of belonging, is tied to every other being's sense of well-being. that there can be no well-being for me if everyone else doesn't have that same sense of well-being. That's at the heart of that matriarchal cultural teaching. And so recognizing those things and realizing that reciprocity is again an alteration of exchange, right? This for that. Reciprocal sharing as a circular way of being in relationship with life is very different. And so when we think about how we're living right now, if we want to be living expressions of the gift economy, one thing that we can do right now is we can look at birth and we can look at death. These are both areas that the women have upheld traditionally within our teachings, within our communities, and within our culture. And the afterbirth now is recognized as a biohazardous material, right? And so we have to fight legally to be able to get the afterbirth of our own children in order to be able to acknowledge the transfer from birth mother to earth mother, the changing of being nurtured and sustained by the birth mother and transferring that to the earth mother, who then nurtures and sustains us in that loving place of being held for the rest of our life on earth. So that's at birth. There's already a disruption. And then at death, when our bodies return to the earth and they feed the growth of all other life on the planet, there's a disruption there because our bodies are being poisoned before they're even being put into the ground. And so they pump our bodies full of poison, they put them in a cement box, and then they put them in a wooden box, and then they put them in the ground, keeping us separated through layers of distance from that aspect of reciprocal relationship and reciprocal sharing. So as we're thinking about all of these things, I just want to end with this one thing, and then I'll be done. So this last section that I want to read, this tiny little paragraph from the book, it says, "The life givers and water bearers have been removed from these discussions. Therefore, the decisions that have been made by our governments and industrial leaders have not adequately weighed the consequences to life. As a result, we are all suffering. To rebalance our relationship with life, the voices of the water bearers must once again come forward and be honored, because we are not only the carriers of life and the thread of life, we are the carriers of the gift, and the gift, the true gift, is life. And that is the gift in the maternal economy, is the gift of life." And so I want to say Kachiwaliwan to all of the women that are here participating in this. Kamachka Zalmo to Jen, I love you so much. Thank you for bringing us back together. And Pasilda and Dilnabamuk, I offer these words for all of my relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherri. Thank you so much for those words. And we're going to move from the continent of the United States to the Green Isles of Ireland and Mary Condren, who is the director of Women's Spirit Ireland and a research fellow at the Center for Gender and Women's Studies in the School of Histories and Humanities at Trinity College, Dublin. Her critical work concerns the role of violence and the discourse of sacrifice in contemporary politics. Her constructive work focuses on recuperating the Indigenous female traditions of old Europe in Ireland. So welcome, Mary, and we are so happy to have you back with us again today.
Thank you, Letecia, and thank you for all of the contributions that have been made so far. I'm sorry that I'm the bearer of bad news after all the great ideas and positivity that we've just heard for the last hour and a half, because I will be talking today about my deconstructive work, which is on sacrifice and violence. However, I can't apologize for it, because what I want to speak about is an important part of why the gift economy has been erased, and why the language of death and destruction and war has been given such prominence in our culture. And particularly, I'm speaking as a feminist theologian and feminist theorist, and speaking specifically about the way in which theology and religions have played their part in erasing the female from the world and giving rise to such violence. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and I've got a lot of quotations on the PowerPoint, and I won't be reading the quotations unless I get very nervous, which I may well do, but I will be speaking to them and to the headings, but the quotations will be given out in the PowerPoint, and I've also provided a bibliography on the PowerPoint for anybody who wants to follow up any of the material that I will be running through fairly quickly, as that has to be in the time available. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, the title of my contribution then is Dying for Peace, Sacrifice and the Perversion of Love. In Ireland, we had also a long history of colonization for over 800 years. And also in Ireland, we were forbidden to speak our language, to practice our ceremonies under pain of death and execution by the English colonizers. In the 19th century, a revival movement began, which is a revolutionary movement, and the language of sacrifice ran through that movement and also throughout the First World War. Sacrificial discourse was running riot. Now, we had a very famous poet whom you may have heard of, William Butler Yeats, and he wrote a poem on 1916, which was the time when the revolutionaries decided to make their mark. And Easter 1916, they coincided the revolution with the Easter ceremonies very deliberately. William Butler Yeats wrote a very important poem called Easter 1916, and it was a critique of what had actually happened. It's a very, very long poem, and I'm just going to take out extracts from it. At the very beginning of the poem, he said, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice?" And like I said, he was writing that in the light of the discourse of sacrifice that was running riot throughout the First World War, and also the Easter Rising. He also, at the end of that poem, he wrote, "A terrible beauty is born." Now, the question is, what was that terrible beauty? And one of the ways I've learned to understand the terrible beauty is in the continuity between religious discourse, religious symbols and religious rites, and the post-religious, as it were, secular society in which we live. And Pierre Bourdieu, who writes about masculine domination, speaks about the mystic boundaries, the mystic rites, the language of the magical transformation and symbolic conversion produced by ritual consecration, the basis of a new birth. In other words, he's talking about a fundamental continuity between religious discourse and political discourse as we know it today. The central narrative that I want to relate this to, which I found very helpful when I'm teaching on the question of gender and the culture of violence, is a story that we all know, and I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. It's the Garden of Paradise story, where, as you know, Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Paradise, and they were forbidden to eat the fruit from a certain tree, and of course they did, at the behest of the serpent, who was the ancient representation of the life force. And because they did that, Yahweh barred them from access to the tree of life, because in fact there were two trees in the garden. The woman was punished disproportionately because, according to Adam, the woman made me do it. And Yahweh placed the cherubim and the seraphim at the Garden of Eden in order to make sure that nobody would ever get back into the garden, so long as the great insult to Yahweh, which was a sin of disobedience, was still unassuaged. Okay, now in our culture, and I just thought of this song this morning, there is a long tradition of trying to metaphorically get back to the garden and I found this song online. I was born to be royal. I was made to be free. I was torn from the garden when that devil lied to me. Take me back to the garden. Take me back and walk with me. For your presence I am longing. Take me back, God. Take me back. Back to your kingdom come. Take me back. Back to your kingdom come. Now, how do we get back into the garden? The whole question of sacrifice becomes absolutely crucial in this development, because according to the major Christian theology, the only way back to the garden, or the only way to assuage the fundamental sin that was caused by Adam and Eve, as it were, was through the sacrificial death of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And that has also got parallels in other religions also, which we'll look at the moment. But the great feminist philosopher Letecia Irigaray, she says, it would seem to me to be appropriate to inquire whether under the sacrifice victim, the ostensible victim is Jesus and Abraham or Isaac or Hussein, another victim is often hidden. There's a very interesting psychoanalyst called Franco Fenari, an Italian psychoanalyst, and he's written a book called The Psychoanalysis of War. And he says the psychoanalytic answer to this question, or at least a certain type of psychoanalytic answer, leads us precisely and again back to food as the mother's original gift to the child. This is what that absolute and unconditional something that men carry in the deepest part of himself as a love object transfigured and absolutized, as a sort of paradise enjoyed in the beginning, but quickly lost. We're talking about there regaining the lost paradise of the mother. So Irigaray comments on that. She says, they remain now and forever nostalgic for their first roots in the mother, but the immediacy of that nostalgia is killed or contradicted. This does not solve the problem, however. These swings between treetops and roots shows up again in the culture's movement, up and down and in wars. Fenari goes on to say, human life becomes a continuous attempt, more or less hopeful and more or less desperate, to regain this precious object. With one of these vicissitudes of regaining the original food and the unity with the mother and her lost gift seems to be connected to the deepest origin of group formation. He goes on to say that, drawing on the thesis of Geza Roheim, that the social relation takes the place of the relation to the mother. He's talking there about group dynamics, and particularly the kind of group dynamics that take place in war. Man tends to maintain as a fiction that which he cannot preserve as a reality. The individual's experience in the group has a significance that tends to be illusory. Since it's aimed at denying her loss, the illusory recovery of the lost mother in the group is related to what we've called the manic elaboration of mourning. And just to say that in monasteries and convents all around the world, the last hymn that is sung at night in the Christian tradition is about the banished children of Eve. In other words, that after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. That is the hymn of mourning. Now, in the sacrificial social contract, we can return to the Garden of Paradise, but only after death. But religious discourse has passed seamlessly to the secular realm, in the sense that the words indebtedness, we owe a great indebtedness to the savior figures, redemption, the salvation, and sacrifice, which is the gift, which is another kind of perverse gift, the sacrifice of the self. Any indebtedness to the natural earth or the maternal gifting of mothers is erased, superseded by the perverse gifting of sacrifice that takes place through war. Now, the maternal gift is erased in Western society because the indebtedness is not in any way an acknowledgement of the gift of the mother. Indebtedness is to the savior founding figure, whether it's Jesus and God the Father, or Abraham and Isaac, or Hussein, the grandson of Muhammad. Karl Marx talked about alienation. if you remember in Capital, he talked about the alienation of labor power, the surplus labor, which was kind of a gift that was given to the owners. But he talked about alienation and how about what has been alienated has the power to act back on consciousness. Ivan Strensky, who's a theorist of sacrifice, talks about this as another kind of, I'm using the word alienation, but he's talking here about the gift. And thus considering sacrifice as a special kind of gift, sacrifice will show all the same characteristics of gifts in general, but with the added feature of at least portions of their sacrificial gift being alienated from the human realm in the process of something being made sacred. This can be elaborated in connection with the human bombers in considering first the obligatory quality of the gift. In other words, he's making the point there that human bombers, and he's written extensively on sacrifice, human bombers are giving a gift of their lives, regardless of the fact that in giving this gift, many other people will be killed, as happened in the Twin Towers and in many other situations. But their understanding of what they're doing is that they are giving a gift. Now, we now have then what we call the return of the repressed. Because the gift of the mother is so deeply buried in the unconscious of our civilization, but it comes back with a bang at a time of war, when soldiers are crying for their mothers. In Manchester, when there was a terrorist attack, some of the people involved wrote on a note, "Mother, please forgive me," hours before he set off the bomb that killed and maimed so many people. His reference, in other words, was to his mother. Bobby Sands, a hunger striker in Ireland who died on hunger strike about 20 years ago, an horrific time in Irish history. But all through the discourse of Bobby Sands' writing, he refers to his mother, as though he can't do whatever he's doing almost without her authority. And throughout the First World War, the chaplains, when they were writing about their experiences in the war, they talked about the airmen crying for their mothers as they lie dying on the battlefield. Because the maternal discourse of the motherland was one of the great forms of propaganda that had enabled young 17, 16, even 14-year-olds who pretended they were 16 and 17 to go to war. And as you know, in the First World War, millions of people, millions of young men were killed on European soil. And so the discourse of the motherland and the discourse of mother, the repressed mother, played a major part in that event. Now, this poem was written by Patrick Pearse. Patrick Pearse was one of the great leaders of the 1916 Rising. He was an artist, he was a teacher, he was a poet, and he was one of the 16 people who was executed as soon as the Rising was over, which initially, when the Rising took place, there was great revulsion on the part of the Irish people. But the English government decided to execute the leaders of the Rising, who were 16 men. And before his death, Patrick Pearse is said to have said that his mother asked him to write a poem that would explain, her position. And so he put into his mother's mouth these words, and this very poem was over the bed of Rose Kennedy, the mother of John and Bobby Kennedy, who also were executed or killed. "I do not grudge them, Lord, I do not grudge my 2 strong sons that I have seen go out to break their strength and die, they and a few, in bloody protest for a glorious thing. They shall be spoken of among their people. The generation shall remember them and call them blessed. But I will speak their names to my own heart in the long nights, the little names that were familiar once round my dead hearth. Lord, thou art hard on mothers. We suffer in their coming and their going, And though I grudge them not, I weary of the long sorrow, and yet I have my joy. My sons were faithful, and they fought. In other words, in that poem written by Patrick Pearse, as ostensibly in the mouth of his mother has given birth to the heroes. Her birthing of them initially as a mother is not on the agenda. And now she is handing over her two sons into the sacrificial social economy. And the awful thing about that particular revolution, if we want to call it that, is that Patrick Pearse was an extraordinary thinker. He was a teacher, and Ireland had an educational system based on the English colonization system, which was brutally beating and abusing children. And he wrote a book called The Murder Machine, which is a blading critique of what was happening in the Irish education system. Another one of the revolutionaries was somebody called James Connolly. And he was one of the first men in Ireland to speak openly about women's liberation. But the fact that they were both executed and removed from any kind of leadership in the future Ireland meant that an extraordinary loss had taken place in their vision and in their brilliance that might have been offered in the long run. So I just want to finish by saying that the language of sacrifice permeates Irish discourse. It permeates the discourse of violence around the world, everywhere. And as I said at the beginning, in my constructive work, I work on the figure of Bridget. And there's one famous quotation where Bridget was, where she took the veil, and she took the beatitude of mercy. And mercy is a matrixial virtue rather than a sacrificial one. And I've written about that in other contexts, especially about the work of Bracha Lichtenberg-Ettinger, who's a philosopher of the matrixial. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share my work in this area. And thank you to Genevieve Vaughan.
Thank you so much, Mary. Before we actually open up to, we have a short period of time for some questions and answers. And Genevieve, I wondered if you might have any words that you would want to share at this point. Otherwise, I can just check in with our, Liliana and Judith to see if they have questions for us. And I see them in the Q&A. Jen?
I think it's a good thing for you just to go ahead and ask for the questions. And I just want to thank everybody, all the speakers who were so wonderful, and Letecia. But anyway.
Beautiful. So I want to also remind you, those of you viewing with us today, and those of you who will be viewing this as a recording, that each of our speakers have other recordings on our website that you can take a look at, and their talks and presentations, if they had PowerPoints, will be available with the recording. So let's start with the questions. I know we have only about 30 minutes to be able to go through 13 questions. That's quite a bit, but maybe we can pick out a few. So Liliana, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I have a question for all the speakers from Maria Suarez. What is needed in media to deepen the struggle for alternative paradigms like gift economy?
Jen, would you like to start in response to that?
Well, maybe what is really needed is more women, feminist, maternal feminists in media. That's my quick answer.
Thank you, Jen. I think, yes, it's actually quite a deep question, because this is a challenge that we've had in trying to get the message out. So Heide, would you like to offer any quick answer that you might have for that question? I know it's quite big.
Yes, we need more feminist media, but I think media is not all what we need. We also need to stand up in the streets, to make our goals, our ideas, and our paradigm shift visible in the streets as a movement of women and all who are with the women. You see, you can see the example of the Fridays of Future. They became very much visible, and the medias were following the movement. Then they were portraying all these people and the Greta Thunberg and so on. The media is not the first point. The first point is to become visible on the streets with our ideas, with our demands, and with our shifted consciousness to a completely different paradigm. It's my idea.
Thank you, Heidi. How about you, Sherri?
I mean, there have been documentaries done about the challenges of having even women's voices within mainstream media be portrayed. So women directors aren't having their work being put forward. Women aren't being brought into work on films, even when they've had incredible success in the past. So there's a systematic silencing of women's voices within mainstream media. And I kind of view this the same way that I view academia, that we can't be looking for the channels that have been so well carved out by the patriarchy and expect to float our boats in those channels and then call what we're doing matriarchy. We need to be able to create our own pathways. And so there needs to be something outside of the mainstream media done, as Heide was talking about. You know, we need to be standing up in the streets, but we need to be standing up in the streets in a way that honors all voices. You know, that requires us to do some work that it may be a little bit uncomfortable for us in the process of moving forward. You know, nobody wants to be standing out on the streets handing out pamphlets or marching with signs. You know, we want to be comfortable in our homes eating soup by the fire, right? So we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, because that point of friction is where change happens. So, you know, I think that's what's most needed, is a little bit of willingness to be uncomfortable in order to be able to have those voices be heard on a larger stage.
Thanks, Sherri. How about you, Darsha?
We need to get back to our hearts, out of our heads and out of our survival system gut reactions, back to connecting heart-wise, heart-mindedness is required. And that's also in getting back to our bodies, getting back on the earth, becoming earth-centric again. Just every day, in every way, are we thinking about the web of life and all our actions and our decisions? Are we accounting for their well-being, the well-being of the whole bio community? And I think that then leads us to the mothering that the earth demonstrates for us every day, and helps us calm down, become more humble. We're earth creatures. We're not going anywhere. And to honor many indigenous ways of being and letting them lead the way with their traditional ecological knowledge, but getting back to our earth centrism.
Thank you, Darsha. How about you, Mary? Do you have any suggestions about what we can do in the media to get more visibility for these alternatives?
Well, just before we started this evening, you said that you told me that the next sessions are going to be on language. And I think language is hugely important, because I know that like in the place where I live, there's a whole generation of people doing extraordinary work under the name of voluntarism, under the name of benevolence, under the name of charity, under the name of you name it, quite apart from the work of parenting, which is unpaid. And of course, there's a difficulty in the sense of does anybody want to quantify that, or, you know, and make it less than being a gift? You don't want to do that. But at the same time, I think we do need to say, these are the unrecognized, this is the unconscious of the social order, and that unconscious needs to be brought into consciousness. And I think language will be a fundamental starting point for that, changing language. Just for instance, I wrote an article a couple of years ago on Bridget, and I called her the matron of poetry, healing, and smithwork. And now, for instance, there has been a movement to make Bridget's Day a national holiday next February, or maybe the following year, but from now on. And she's not known as another patron saint of Ireland, she's known as a matron saint of Ireland. And so those little things like that really do begin to make a difference. So I think language, and I'm looking forward to the session on language that the team will be organizing after Christmas.
Thank you, Mary, for plugging that for us. Yes, we're also we're also very excited about that in January of 2022. So thank you for that. And I think, let me just bring in Judith to see if there's another question that we might be able to offer to the group.
I have two related questions. Karina talks about geoengineering, and a Finnish millionaire who suggested that air and ecosystems should be privatized in order to save them. And then Maria Suarez pointed out that that's happening in the oceans as well, with the use of coral planting to privatize the seabed as a new present day colonial process. And so the question is, can the panelists comment on the concept of geoengineering and saving the planet by privatizing it?
Well, I think that Vandana would have quite a bit to say about that. Fortunately, she's not here to respond. I'm wondering if any of you are our current panelists that are available, would you like to address that question? Sherri, how about you? Do you have any comment? I'm sure you do, as a legal environmentalist specialist here.
I think that we, as with all things, we need to be very, very careful, because a lot of geoengineering, especially it comes to climate change, there are a lot of false climate change solutions being proposed under concepts of geoengineering that are nothing more than a masking of the status quo, which is to create new markets and new economies. And I look at geoengineering oftentimes in that way. The move to privatization is another move to cleverly be able to take over possession, because there's a small group of people who are controlling everything because they have all the resources, who have been at the heart of the destruction of our planet. And to think that privatization, which puts those things that belong to the commons into the hands of the few who have been responsible for the destruction of our planet, is a good idea, is evidence of global insanity, in my opinion. And so, I think that we need to be putting more things back into the commons. We need to be putting more things back into the collective hands of the people who are relying upon those things to sustain their lives. Because right now, everything that we take out of the hands of those who are required or living in connection with those things for sustainability has been destroyed by those who have been in positions of power. So that's a soundbite of my opinion on that. I could talk about that all day.
Thanks, Sherri. Jen, is there something that you might want to offer to that?
Well, no, I think Sherri said it really well. For me, it's just another turn of the screw of what's going on, the same privatization or capture of of what was once a gift, or anything that was in some level a gift. So it's like we're paving the planet, and life cannot be there. It's really awful.
Thank you, Jen. Heide, do you have something you'd like to offer here?
Yes, I fully agree with Sherri. We need to put the economy back in the hands of people. I would specialize this a little bit. We need to put the economy back in the hands of women, especially in the hands of mothers. As it was in traditional matriarchal society, the economy was in the hand of women. And so the whole society flourished. And I think this is not easy, but this is the demand of the time, that the economy comes back into the hand of the women, at least half of it, at least the shared economy. And this is not easy to obtain. And I think it needs a matriarchal revolution, which might begin in internet, in media, and on the streets. Okay, this I would like to add.
Thank you, Heide. Mary or Darcia, do you have anything that you would like to offer?
I just come back to the question of language again. Very often when people begin to talk about the goddess culture or matriarchy, and they say, oh, that's fertility cults. There's a massive fertility cult going on in world economics, where the guys are, competing to be the first ones to eject themselves, as it were, into space, competing against one another to prove whose phallus is the biggest. And I think we need to name that fertility cult again for what it is. So, again, I could just go back to language. We need to work on the language and to actively deconstruct the propaganda that's coming down unchallenged.
I agree. Thank you so much for that. How about another question? Who is it, Judith or Liliana?
Me.
Okay, Liliana.
I have a question for all the speakers, and this is the question. How do we divorce from the capitalist economy? How do we find a land to live on without capital? Or if, for example, we manage to acquire a land, create a common eco-village, etc., the state will still be able to take in some way either tax or if they decide to mine, etc. And some things we cannot make ourselves. How can we implement a gift economy? Just relying on donations? This seems still based on the contemporary money, which is based on slavery and violence. How do we break free? This is for all the speakers.
Well, I think in the amount of time we have left, we can't really thoroughly address an answer to that question. But what I'd like to do is just create an opportunity for perhaps Jen to start in maybe just getting a little soundbite. It's very, very challenging. These are questions that in our network, we have women who have 18 years experience as an eco-village and things that are starting now. But this is, again, we are explorers in the reclaiming of these traditions. I don't think that there's any right way. And each of us individually must do our own part, or we will not be able to actually make that shift. So let's start with Genevieve, if you have some words you'd like to offer.
There are actually lots of eco-villages around the world. Look them up online. And there are several of them that actually try to live according to the gift economy. Maybe they don't really use the maternal gift economy as the idea, but they do try gift economy without rooting it in the maternal. So you could take a look at those, see what other people have done.
Thanks, Jen. Heide, do you have any short soundbite? This is, I think, a lifelong discussion, but perhaps an insight that you might have?
It's really not possible to answer this in a short statement. So what I wanted to say, I said it just before. We really need a matriarchal revolution, and we have to think about how we could put it into practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. How about you, Darsha?
Well, I think we have to honor children. Children are, especially the younger children, are still in tune with the universal energies before we kind of drum it out of them in schooling. And we need to honor their intelligence and their development, and they will lead the way. They have spiritual guides that we don't understand. I think a lot of the young people now are coming up with much greater intelligence than previous generations. And so whatever we can do to support children in their development and their wisdom for leading us into the future, I think is really important. So I'll just say that from a psychology perspective, let's honor the kids.
Thanks, Darsha. Mary, how about you?
No, I agree with what everybody has said so far, so thank you.
Thank you. And Sherri, I know that you're in the first stages of your own forging a new culture, so please share some of your insights right now.
I think we need to, I think one of the things that's challenging is that, we look at the currency of an economy as the basis of economy, right? And really it's the way that moves within in the community that really builds the economy. And so how we approach this, we need to approach this from a balanced perspective. We can't be so concerned with every terminology that having, what I like to say is we can't have our minds be so open that our brains fall out. And we can't be closed to new ideas and new ways of thinking. So, I think that when we think about wanting to be able to build a community, a matriarchal community, there are many entry points into that community that folks can take. And it doesn't have to be a physical location, although that's what we're doing here at Wajjukum Tultina, here in where I live right now. Wajjukum Tultina is a 200+ acre piece of land that I reclaimed in my own traditional territory that had been taken from our tribe and given away in a land grant in 1820. And here, all of the rules that we operate under are based on matriarchal, matricultural, matrifocal. And as you said, Letecia, even though we come from that cultural tradition, there's still a relearning of living in that way outside of the parameters of the worldview that we've been forced through practices of domination to live within. And so it's an evolving process of not swinging the pendulum to the place of having a matriarchy that resembles the patriarchy, but with women at the helm, but something that's much more centered in that heart-based divine intuition aspect of the sacred feminine, which can be embodied in any body. Like Jen always talks about, mothering is an expression of love. And there are plenty of people who have been mothered by their fathers because they didn't have a biological mother in their life, that have been raised by aunties or, other relatives, that these aspects are aspects of being and doing that are connected to, ways of knowing and being that we're applying in real time. So that I think that there are many entry points into that way of being and way of coming together that might lead to occupation to a piece of land that allows for this, but it could also just be a collective of human beings who live in proximity together, who want to incorporate these notions into their ways of being in relationship with one another, because at the heart of it, it's really about relationship. The maternal gifting economy is really about having harmonious, balanced, equitable, and just relationships with one another.
Yes, I think it's really key to be reminded one cannot do the gift economy alone. We need, we really need one another to do the gift economy. And I'd like to just propose a perspective, something that those of us who are alive today might be able to relate to, which is the cellular telephone, the bane of everyone's existence in this moment. But we have all experienced the onset of how the cellular phone was once only available to a few, and then it became available to many. That's the notion of the gift economy. Wherever you are, whatever edge of culture that you're in, your choice to live the values of the gift economy will bring forward a transformation. It's not going to happen all at once. It just doesn't happen that way. So even the regulations with what happened with the cellular phone, they rose up as those development happened. The same thing will happen with the maternal gift economy. Not only will we change from the inside out, but all of the levels of state will change as we gather more steam in our courage and our experience and our expression of the gift economy. So I'm kind of joining Genevieve and Sherri Mitchell and Heide and all the women on the panel to rally the call for standing up for the maternal gift economy. So ready, go. All right, next question. Go ahead, Judith.
The question is, what is the relationship between end-of-life practices and the gift economy and Mother Earth that we've and breaking through that we've been talking about?
I'm just going to be very brief because I feel like I've talked a lot and I know we're in the last moment, so I want to give others a chance to weigh in on this. And I think that really the correlation is the valuation of life. It's a relationship that you have with life. And when we're talking about life, we're talking about birth, we're talking about the ways that we live in relationship with one another, or relationship with Mother Earth, the relationship that we have with death, and that process of regeneration of our bodies into the nourishment for the next generations to come. That all of that really is an expression of your connection to life. And what the gift economy, I think, is really giving us is it's reconnecting us to the valuation of the sacredness of life, because at the core of it is that gift of life. And so that's how I see it in connection to this. And so the breaking free is really a moving away from this train that's leading us to our ultimate death, and moving off from that train and moving back into connection with the sacred living body of Mother Earth, which, you know, is the embodiment of the gift. In and of herself, she is the full expression of what the gift represents in our lives.
Thank you, Sherri. Jen, would you like to offer?
Yeah, I would say that when you're giving, you give forward, and then that other person may give again, and the other person may give again. So there's a circulation of gifts. And so if your life is a gift and you're given to Mother Earth, there's still a continuation that you can expect in other people's lives, or in your own, some sort of survival of some kind that you don't know, or reincarnation. Whereas in exchange, you give in order to get back, and there's a separation between you and community, and it stops there. And so the whole exchange mode separates us from the earth and each other, and makes death much more final and more scary, and more solitary than it is in a community based on gifting. That's what I think.
Thank you, Jen. Heide, do you have some words you might want to offer?
in the matriarchal societies, the end of life is not end of life, but life comes to death, and death comes back to life. It's thinking in a circle, in a sacred circle, and not in a linear way we are accustomed to in patriarchy, where we have a beginning and a definite end. Thinking in circles, the whole nature is, and the circle of life is not linear, it's circular. And I think the question of life and death must be included in this circular thinking. Then we cannot discuss properly about end of life. What shall this be? If you think circular, then it doesn't end in a special way. It only goes over to different stages, to different situations, and comes back in another situation again. It's difficult for us because we are so much accustomed to individualistic thinking, which is also linear. It's difficult for us to acquaint ourselves in circular thinking. In my opinion, the solution lies in this other kind of thinking, which is typical for matriarchal societies.
Thank you, Heidi. Mary, do you have some words you'd like to offer to this topic?
Well, just when we were talking about the relationship between Maria and Butis and the circle of life, one of the things that I've been discovering in my work on Bridget is the importance of a thing called the kris. We call it the kris, but it's actually a belt. And the belt is something that is like a serpent, or it's like an umbilical cord. It's not quite sure what it is, but it symbolizes the entrance into the world through birth. And then it's used at initiation, it's used at weddings, it's used to bind the husband and wife together. And we've been using the kris in our Bridget celebrations for many, many years. And one of the times when the chairperson of Women's Spirit was dying, I remember going up to where she lived and taking the kris with me and surrounding her. She was, she was dying for several days, and I surrounded her with the kris in her bed. And then at her funeral, we took the kris out again, and we encouraged the funeral participants to walk through it. And I wasn't all that conscious of what we were doing, except that some kind of cellular memory was evoked in doing that signified the umbilical cord, the circle of life, and the continuity between birth, life, and death. And again, I think it's really important to reclaim those ceremonies so that we bring to consciousness that kind of continuity into our ritual lives, which at the moment are severely challenged, you might say, in the West.
Thank you, Mary. Darsha, I see that you put something into the chat. Did you want to just share a few words before we actually go into our closing?
Yes, there was a question about how to help implement the Evolved Nest. And so I put our website there so people can go. There's lots of information and stuff. In terms of this question, so patriarchal civilization has pushed us into an ego psychology, because when you're not nested well, that's what happens. You feel you have to build a bunch of defenses to survive, really, because you feel so distressed and in despair as a baby, left alone to cry, or alone, which is not our earth-centric way. And so that sense of ego that we are encouraged to develop, then you hang on to it, right? It's like that's all you have. And so we have to get back to our more right brain orientation of understanding that we're all connected and the energies are all dynamic around us, and there's spiritual aspects, the unmanifest. The Hopi have suggested that we're in our fourth or fifth world, and we're kind of screwing this one up too. So we'll have another one, and we'll try again to construct a world that where everyone can flourish, which we had for quite a long time. It's just recently, we've been around for 6 million years as a genus, 2 million as a species. And it's only in the last few millennia that we really kind of went in the wrong direction. We forgot the wellness informed pathways. So letting go of ego. So we have to have practices to do that, to get back into the awareness of de-differentiation, that we're all shapeshifters, really. And that's part of our long standing heritage of being able to be the animal, move in and out of different ways of being, and not be so connected to one little way of identity, one ego identity. So there's a lot of healing practices that can be done in this manner. And then you start to relax and realize, well, this world is kind of not going well, but there'll be another one, right? We're all here. We're not going anywhere. We'll be part of the next world, whatever that is. And hopefully it'll be highly a maternal gift economy where we can all flourish together.
Thank you, Darsha. It sounds like you just gave us some closing statements that encapsulates your work. So I would like to be able to give each of the other speakers a moment before we actually close the session with a thank you prayer from Sherri, and then just some administration from me. So Mary, do you have some closing statement that you'd like to offer? Darsha did such a wonderful job with her last statement that I think it reflects her work, and she put her website up. So Mary?
I think one of the things that we might want to do is to remember that we actually do live in a garden of paradise, and that we don't have to wait until we're dead in order to enjoy the fruits of that garden. I remember somebody saying to me years ago, as part of a religious education thing, well, it's up to Catholics, you know, to create lots of children, because as soon as heaven is full up, the world will come to an end. And I started laughing. I started laughing, and this was not the right thing to do, but I thought it was so ludicrous that the denial of our earthly life was so thoroughly imbued with that notion. So I think that's it. Remember, we do live in a garden of paradise, and all the apples and the knowledge and the tree of knowledge and the tree of life and the dew of mercy in particular, which is another very important symbol, the dew of mercy, which is the fruit, the umbilical, the uterine fluids coming from the earth that we capture, that we soak into our cloaks at our festivals. That is the dew of the earth, and to remember that the earth is in an eternal state of pregnancy. Thank you, and thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you, Mary. Heide.
Yes, I hope that we can get rid more and more of patriarchy, not only in the economic and social realm, but also in our minds and souls. And for we are always and again brainwashed with patriarchal ideas and identifications and images and so on. This goes on and on. And I hope that we can learn more and more from matriarchal societies and of our own matriarchal past, so that we can look through more and more through these patriarchal internalizations, which are always given to us from childhood on, and can get rid of it in our minds. For I think this has consequences in our ways of life, where we also want to get rid of patriarchal patterns we are still forced to live in. So I still believe that a matriarchal revolution is not so far.
Thank you, Heidi. Genevieve.
Well, I think we need to recognize the gifts when they're given, and that is the gift of you, Letecia, Diane, and all of the crew that's been helping with all of these wonderful salons for a whole year. I mean, this is an enormous gift. And there's Liliana, Elena, and Judith. All of you all have helped so much each and cooperated in such a beautiful way. I must say it's a fantastic privilege to have been part of this and been gifted by you with this wonderful platform for the gift economy to be spoken from. And so thank you so much. It's been a fantastic year. And thank you to all of the people who have spoken tonight and throughout the year.
Thank you, Genevieve. And Sherri, last but not least, I thought you could offer your words and then offer a word of thanks and prayer, and then I'll just do some administration and we'll close.
Thank you, Letecia. You know, I think that we're so challenged at this time. And so one of the things that I want to leave you with is something from the book again, which is this notion that we are not here by accident, that we are not placeholders in time, that we actually were born for the times that we're living in. And so because we're born for the time that we're living in, we have the skills and the capacity to do the work that's required of us in this time. And I think that one of the challenges that we are facing in our race toward wholeness is to recognize that we can't bypass the work. We can't bypass the work that's required of us to get there, which means working through all of the challenges of our time, dealing with race issues, dealing with inequity in economics, in academics, in environmental injustice, you know, all of these other areas where there are injustices and imbalances and inequities. We have to be willing to recognize that what we're truly learning is how to be, as one species, an expression of biodiversity within ourselves, which means that every individual group or individual person has something very unique and precious to the whole. One of the most beautiful things that I've heard came out of a book by this Canadian author called The Wild Wood, where they talk about as each species goes extinct, that species' song dies. And that song contributes to this great symphony of life that we're all part of. And so as songs are being silenced, we're losing the true measure of that symphony of life that we're all trying to harmonize and balance ourselves with. And so I would encourage you all to have the fortitude, the resilience to do the work that's required of you, to be able to acknowledge that we're not trying to become one homogenized whole, that oneness and sameness are not equal, and that we're trying to become this diverse expression of ourselves in the way that the biodiverse ecosystems around us are modeling for us. And that requires us to honor one another and our uniqueness. And so I just want to offer very brief, in my way, closing prayer. So, Kachiwili wan kachiniwas ekchamundo, Kachiwili wan kachibitsits, Zakiladuk, Zawanakik, Inkiladuk, Dabumkisk, Awebik, Amigik, Indalam Hagik, Kachiwiliwan, Kasalmopa, Kamach Kasalmo, to all of you. And I just wanted to say that I just thanked the sacred beings from all of the different directions for being with us today, for guiding us. And you are one of those sacred beings from different directions, as we're representative of all of these different points on the earth. And so I honor you and your contributions, and thank you all. And I will just say in closing for myself, Basilda and Dilnabamuk, that what I offer here is for all of my relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherri. So we are at the close of our time together today. I want to officially just thank our speakers, Genevieve Vaughan, Vandana Shiva, Darsha Navares, Heide Goettner-Abendroth, Sherri Mitchell, and Mary Condren. Behind the scenes, we wouldn't be able to be here if it weren't for the support of Diane and Elena, who handle our tech, and for Liliana and Judith. So I'm going to out you. Can you please turn on your cameras and wave at everyone so people can see your glorious faces just for once? Please, please, pretty please. Elena. Yes. Thank you all for all of your hard work. And the International Feminists for a Gift Economy Network, your work over the course of all of these years, your relationships with each other and with Jen has brought us to this point today, and we are grateful. And for those of you who are viewing us today, you are gently invited to join our army or to join our network for the International Feminists for the Gift Economy. We're going to be taking off for the month of December. And with that, it's an opportunity for you to review our year. We have had 23 salons that you can review, plus last year's conference. So please enjoy the gifts of our bounty from last year. We are going to return in January 2022, and Mary Condren gave you a little bit of insight, but we hope that for the month of January, we'll have 2 salons that feature this whole notion of language, how we can embody this language differently, reclaim it at the maternal roots so we can find the gifts that allow us to break through this patriarchal mindset, that we can stand in that right at the front of each of our edges so we can make this shift to the maternal gift economy. Our video recording is going to be posted on the Maternal Gift Economy Movement.org. And if you want to be notified of any of our upcoming events and salons, please sign up at our website, the Maternal Gift Economy Movement.org. And we welcome your feedback, comments, and questions at maternalgifteconomy@gmail.com. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and for your commitment, for your heart-open listening. Please be well, stay safe, be kind to one another, and remember that in this season that people call this holiday season, that your presence is a gift. That Sherri pointed out that we were born for this. And I want to thank you for your courage and your tenacity and your commitment. Blessings to all of you, and thank you so much. We'll see you in January. Bye for now.